The world is facing a demographic crisis that has kind of come as a bit of a shock. Just a few decades ago, the great fear was overpopulation and the impact that it would have on the world's resources and natural systems. Today, many major economies around the world are dealing with exactly the opposite problem. Birth rates in most countries, especially advanced countries, have been falling steadily, and today we are well below the replacement rate, meaning that without immigration from a few regions that are still having children, our countries will start to shrink. This has a lot of economists in particular extremely worried about the impacts that this could have on systems that depend on a growing number of people producing a growing number of goods and services for a growing economy. The concern has become so severe that many governments around the world are now considering or actively experimenting with just paying people to have children as a way to reverse or at the very least slow down this problem. These policies will cost trillions of dollars and reshape the global economy, but they've been tried before, and they're responsible for some of the most severe economic problems in the world today. Even very light implementations of these systems to influence birth rates, like child tax credits, which are at the centre of economic policy debate right now, can have profound impacts on economies, and it's often not until decades later that these impacts are fully realised. The medicine may be worse than the illness, but it's also important to understand why a shrinking population is apparently such a big problem in the first place. To properly grapple with what may be one of the most dangerous economic tools in the arsenal, we need to, as always, answer a few important questions. Why are populations shrinking? Why is this such a problem? And finally, why is paying people to have children such a terrible solution to this problem? Managing a video production business means juggling tons of documents, reports, and feedback, and we needed a tool to keep it all organised. That's why we rely on Notion AI, and it's been a total game changer. We've talked about Notion before, but they've recently launched new AI features that take it to the next level. One of our favourite features, it can pull insights from files and attachments across tools like Slack and Google Drive without even opening them. Just last week, I asked Notion AI to create a work-back plan from a project brief. It prioritised everything instantly, saving me so much time. We use Notion AI daily to streamline our entire video production process. It helps us organise deadlines, analyse feedback, and find long-lost information across our databases, saving us hours of lost search time. Notion is simply one of the greatest productivity tools on the internet. The most amazing thing is that Notion is free to try, so use our link in the description to try Notion now. In the early 2000s, a fair amount of people, from stand-up comics to politicians, would crack jokes about the rising population all over the world, usually founded on the belief that Earth and the economy were buckling under the weight of consumption. But while these issues aren't entirely false, the assumption and the jokes were predicated on a partial truth. The global population is rising, but it has little to do with reproduction. According to the UN, the world's population will exceed 10 billion over the course of the next 34 years, and at its peak, contrary to what many assumed, it will start to decline. The fact is, most people overlooked elements like the gradual rise in life expectancy fueled by advancements in nutrition, hygiene, medicine, and healthcare, while ignoring the key indicator, growth rate, the only metric that matters when it comes to predicting a country's population and its future impact on the economy. The last time the population growth rate hit record highs was back in the 1960s, when it reached 2% annually. Now it's less than 1%, with most analysts predicting that it will dip under 0.1% in less than a century. There are two major factors that have made even the average person start to pay attention to these figures: ageing populations and low fertility. The latter being the easier one to influence without some drastic actions. Only a handful of countries get a ton of coverage regarding their ageing population. The reality is this is a widespread concern, with many trailing behind those under the spotlight by just a few percentage points. In 2022, World Population Prospects pointed out that people aged 65 plus are growing exponentially, far faster than younger demographics, growing from 10% of the global population to 16% in the next 25 years. Put another way, those 65 years of age or above will be about twice as common as children under the age of 5. Of course, an ageing population isn't necessarily a problem. More people getting to grow old is arguably one of the most valuable outcomes that an economy can produce. What's more is that it opens the doors for new labour to take the torch with the strength to complete difficult physical tasks and fresh ideas brought on with the advancements in education that are greatly assisted by having a large population of elderly people with decades of technical expertise and good old-fashioned life experience. But this transfer only works if there are enough people to carry the workload of their predecessors. And this is what makes the stalling growth rate so troubling. To keep things stable, every woman would need to have an average of slightly more than 2 children to account for early mortality, which is thankfully low in advanced economies these days and shrinking rapidly across the world, but it does still exist, so around 2.1 to 2.3 births per woman is normally marked as the replacement rate. Yet for major economies like the US, this golden number bobbed up and down through the 1970s, and by the end of the decade it dropped below 2 and has never recovered since. The cause of this low fertility in most countries can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution when living standards began to change. For example, when the UK began to industrialise in the 19th century, annual per-person income grew almost 8 times faster than the century prior. A drop in mortality paired with consistently rising birth rates led to a population boom that didn't slow down for 100 years. After a demographic transition, one that has been almost identical across similar countries, historians found that the UK's focus shifted towards capital retention to improve the quality of life for their families, where fertility finally caught up with mortality at fairly low levels. Of course, the cause of this was widespread urbanisation, where farms were traded in for densely populated towns and cities closer to the machinery that dramatically improved output. With more reliance on urban living for its ability to drive economic wealth, people found it increasingly difficult to raise the same number of children, which led to the earlier growth rates. For a farmer who lives where they work, child rearing is far easier. They don't have to worry about where to put their children during the day because the kids are usually there helping to carry the load, learning the trade as they go along. But in the city, parents have to find ways to protect and look after their children while in factories or offices, and there isn't as much space to have a traditional agrarian family of 3 to 12 in a 2-bedroom apartment. Moreover, there was a period where societies tried bringing kids into the factories to make things easier, however that didn't go so well, and modern services made child labour much more of a liability than an asset like on a family farm, even outside of the whole ethical concern. With this change in lifestyle came a cultural shift as well. More women than ever before continue to enter the workforce, with many of them unable to raise children the way they did just 50-some years ago. There are also modern contraceptives that make family planning far easier, and many people are just holding off on relationships or outright refusing to date altogether. When people are coupling up with one another, there are a number of social trends in the US, like dinks or dual income no kids, where a large portion of the 43% of childless households refuse to have children in order to focus on their career or other personal preferences, and this is a trend that only increases as countries become more developed. As socioeconomic norms change with the times, children look more like an expensive obligation than a borderline necessity, especially for those hoping to hold on to their present living conditions. There are a number of people, most notably billionaires and wealthy influencers, making the argument that having as many kids as possible is a worthy sacrifice, saying that the financial gamble is just part of what's required to keep humanity from caving in on itself, even going as far as saying that refusing to have children is selfish. This, however, at least in part, ignores the bottom line. Everything is just way too expensive in most countries dealing with the ongoing population crisis. It's a fun thought that everyone can just reproduce their way out of the mounting economic burden, but when most of the world's wages aren't keeping up with sharp rise of living costs, the immediate individual burden of having children is a lot stronger than the theoretical shared future burden of a declining population. Regardless, the population crisis is a big problem for future generations. Economies depend on young people looking out for old people either directly by physically taking care of them or indirectly by paying taxes and producing value to support programs like pensions and old age facilities. Current trends, however, are making this dream unattainable, with extreme examples like South Korea forecasting a future where there won't be enough people to physically look after the elderly, let alone finance long-term care. There is also the matter of how a shrinking population can affect other aspects of the economy as well. With smaller households eager to give their few children a higher quality of life, this can possibly widen the gap between rich and poor far more than the current dynamic already has. There was a time when wealth was distributed amongst a large number of children. However, when parents only have one child and plenty of assets, that one child suddenly becomes twice as wealthy as their parents were, encouraging generational inequality. This has already been seen with China's infamous one-child policy, which might have only lasted about 37 years, but the result, according to household survey data, is that intergenerational income mobility was basically cut in half. Rural farming communities were largely exempted from this policy, and the wealth divide still persists between these groups even after accounting for the expected divide between urban and rural centres, and even in a country that has only had a few decades to build generational wealth. But beyond China and beyond the short-term pain points, some economists argue that this eventual population drop is not a problem, and it could actually be a great thing to put less pressure on resources. At the moment, people are consuming more than they have at any point in human history, growing globally on average by over 300% in just the last 50 years. There are a lot of people who argue that there's plenty to go around, but there are plenty of rising risks that come with an economy that is incapable of matching the material needs of a growing population. Now, a possible solution to the growth problem, if the population continues to decline, could be automation to replace the labour dropping out of the workforce, which, theoretically, could assist in a managed decline. Maybe by the time I retire, AI will be so good that it can research and make YouTube videos better than I can, and maybe general automation will do the same things to jobs that are actually important too. The opposite but equally optimistic philosophy to this is a future with trillions of humans spread out across multiple planets. Of course, it's impossible to predict which way technology will go, but this kind of future does have its own advantages like redundancy and the fact that a larger population means more innovation from more people resolving more big issues. Nobody can predict the future though, so this, for now, is just a fun thought experiment. What matters now are feasible solutions to dealing with the growth rate crisis, and so far nobody's come up with a remotely effective solution except for to create other intrusive, unsustainable policies. Directly interfering in demographics like this has always had massive unintended consequences. Even the inverse, where China introduced the one-child policy, ended up being a catastrophic disaster, especially because culturally they prioritised males. The policy ended less than a decade ago, largely because the government realised that it was dealing with the opposite population problem than they expected, not in small part because of this very policy, which has created huge gender imbalances between people at the ages where they would be looking to start a family. It's created an almost dystopian landscape where men of all ages line up in front of doors to compete for the favour of one nervous woman, attend marriage marketplaces, and when they feel like all hope is lost, pay for AI partners or fake models just to experience some kind of intimacy. In a hard 180 to prevent this nightmare from expanding, regions across China have recently announced parenting subsidy policies, offering one-time payments as high as 30,000 yuan, or about $4,147. And this is where the overlap with China and many other countries begins to appear. The idea that the government can just throw money at the problem, which observers have since discovered is very dumb. Taiwan has dropped over $3 billion to fix its plummeting birth rate, surpassing Japan in low fertility, a country that only has 2 workers supporting each retiree. One of the programs involves 6 months parental leave with a 60% salary, which recently rose to 80% in 2021, along with child-rearing allowances and cash benefits, far more than the average 12 weeks unpaid leave seen in the US. Now, overall, paid maternity leave is a good thing for a long list of reasons that go beyond economics. The problem though is that even with all of these benefits, it still hasn't put a dent in the slowdown whatsoever. South Korea, a country that just broke the global record for the lowest fertility rate, spent about $40 billion in 2022 to encourage people to have kids, with some companies offering money to employees in exchange for starting a family. A continual rise in the cost of living, as well as cultural views on parenting, discouraged most possible participants from having children, which made all of these efforts completely ineffective. There are even talks where governments are considering the introduction of a large baby bonus, often well beyond the level that many countries already pay out, or even more controversially still, a tax on childlessness. This was done in the Soviet Union to encourage population growth for almost its entire history, and the fact that fertility fell after the fall of the Soviet Union and the subsequent dismantling of the Soviet tax policies is often pointed to as proof that these incentives work. The idea is that people are making sacrifices to raise a family for the good of the country, so their childless comrades should also make sacrifices, just in a different way. Now obviously there are a lot of problems with that assumption, not least of which is that the immense financial difficulties people endured after the fall of the USSR probably had more to do with the declining birth rates than any additional tax, which realistically had very little impact on households in the Soviet Union. The fact is, paying people to have children like this has never actually worked, and there are plenty of examples showing that direct interference has been an economic burden at best or a crippling disaster at worst. So many countries spend vast amounts of money to put the fire out with child incentives, while none of them really produce the desired results. People just aren't going to have kids in the current climate, and much of that has to do with how culture has changed over time, but for many, it's more of an economic concern than it is a lifestyle one. A lot of those making the decision to not have kids understand that these quick fix methods are nothing more than a wet band-aid. It only encourages starting a family, not sustaining one. But there are things that can be done. In places like the US, it takes about $250,000 to raise a child into early adulthood, or almost $500,000 if the parents want to send them off to college on their own dime. The money would be better spent alleviating barriers like housing affordability, childcare costs, and the costs of actually giving birth to children. That way people who are genuinely considering having children won't be scared off by the financial burden, and already financially burdened people won't be tempted to make babies to make money. There is no clear answer as to whether or not population decline will be positive or negative in the distant future. Radical adjustments will have to be made regardless of the outcome. That said, if countries struggling with this decline find it necessary to spur growth even a little bit to sustain the current population as is, the correct course of action won't be found in baby bonuses or non-baby taxes. Instead of artificially helping people over the very real financial obstacles of having children in a modern economy, it's much more productive to just address the obstacles. Now, we have mentioned South Korea a lot in this video because it is the country that will experience the real impacts of this population crunch first as the current global frontrunner. Needless to say, a lot of very nervous economists are watching it very closely. We made an entire video on the impacts that this is already having on that economy, and you should be able to click to that on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.